Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another installation from Haunter 64. Today, we are going to be talking about the secret sauce of mixing. Now, I know what a lot of you guys are thinking, but Haunter 64, we've already had tutorials coming from Michael Vsauce about parallel drum compression. What more could you teach me? I've already heard from Thor, God of Thunder, that you need to have the right guitar gear in order to do stuff. And I've heard from the angry swamp troll down over at Spectre Studios that you can't use fake drums. Well, guess what? That's not what we're talking about today. Today, what we're talking about is something I feel like a lot of people don't really explain, and I don't know why they don't explain it, but I'm going to go over with you. All right. So, if we go into our session here, I actually went ahead and pre-recorded just a quick little demo thing. It's nothing, it's like 30 seconds. It's just something to get it off the track because I'm sure you guys are tired of me plugging my album all the time. So what we're gonna do is, as you can see here on my master bus, I actually have no processing whatsoever. The only thing I did was bring the volume down just so it was at acceptable levels for mastering when you do submit mixes, which we can go over that later. As you can see, I've only done editing mixing, on the actual tracks. I didn't do anything to my Superior Drummer, and I didn't export my Superior Drummer. I am lazy, but if you look in my Superior Drummer, you can actually see that I did a couple of moves within the program, nothing too crazy, just stuff to make it blend together better. Say you have a mixing project and you're just like, yeah, this mix sounds good, but it's not where I want it to be. Well, that, my friend, is where the secret sauce of mixing comes in. Now, I'm gonna play the demo real quick, and then we're gonna take a look at what we can do with the secret sauce in order to bring this mix from to you know? So let's take a listen. Alright, there you go. So that's the demo. Now let's go over to our master fader here. Before we even get into making moves on our master fader, I want to try to explain two school of thoughts that a lot of people like to do for this kind of stuff. So school of thought number one is where they do absolutely no processing on the mix bus whatsoever. They just like to have their tracks go in, hear what it sounds like all together, and then come and do the mix bus applications afterwards. However, another school of thought on that is actually this thing called top-down mixing. And with top-down mixing, you're basically emulating on your master bus what it would sound like if you were to send it to a mastering engineer without it actually being mastered. Now, I know a lot of you guys are thinking, well, how would you know? Each mastering engineer is different. Well, you're correct. However, there is a certain amount of stuff that mastering engineers do that is quite typically common, or at least just commonplace. So what a lot of mastering engineers will do is they'll actually come up to around 10K and just give it a little shelf boost. Just a little, nothing crazy. Like right now, I think we're doing about a 3 dB, which is a little nuts. It's about like 1.5. They like to give it a little top end air. Another thing they like to do is adding compression, which comes also from the limiter, but some mastering engineers will add compression before going into the limiter, just as to add a little bit of glue to their mixes. But what we're going to be doing is School of Thought 1 and not School of Thought 2. If we do School of Thought 2, I would like to make a whole separate video starting from starting your session all the way to mixing it, because doing top-down mixing is something you do commonplace at the very beginning of your mix to give you a sense of what you're doing throughout the whole entire mix, rather than just trying to place it at the very end and then make up for mistakes. For mix bus processing, the things that I usually like to go for, and I'm sure a lot of people may agree on this, they may not, first thing I usually do is I put on EQ. Next thing I do is I add compression, because right now, the mix does sound good and everything's kind of fitting in its spots, but it doesn't feel like it's all together. And adding mix bus compression can actually glue your mixes together, which you've heard a lot of. It's basically just kind of having your instruments sit together well. The next step that a lot of people like to do is to use a stereo imager. And if no one is familiar with a stereo imager, I can whip up a really quick demo for it. So this would be like a stereo imager. So right now it's showing us our sound field within the mix itself. So right now it's gotten a little wider now that we put the stereo mixer on. So this is with it on. Alright, and this is with it off. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it and I'm just going to kind of throw it to extremes so you can really see what's going on. And if you're listening at home on an actual studio speaker system, what you can do is pan your mono button, basically summing your mix from stereo to mono, and you'll definitely hear the difference there when that happens. Oh, come on, autofocus. So if you're listening at home on a stereo speaker, you can sum from stereo to mono, and with stereo imagers, that's the one thing you want to be careful of, is keeping your mix mono compatible. So let's do it, and I'm just gonna mess around with settings real quick. Alright, so that's basically stereo imaging. Another thing that I like to do is I actually like to add a gate onto my master bus. So if we look here, I don't think anything's gonna happen because I didn't do anything extreme this time. Normally, sometimes what I'll do is when I'm processing bass a lot of the times, and when you throw it through distortion, a lot of the times the bass distortion will actually kind of leak through at very quiet sections, or sometimes even when you're doing like mix bus compression or you're doing something extreme with guitars, you'll have a little bit of leakage come through. So what I like to do is I like to throw a gate on top. Nothing too serious, always check through your quietest pass first and then set it from there. But just something to kind of quiet down everything when it's going through it. I kind of use a little bit of an ducker setting. I don't really put it at a full gate, because when you duck, you're basically just reducing the level once it hits the threshold to a certain amount. You're not completely shutting off the signal, which is very important sometimes. Alright, so let's begin. So the first thing I like to do is I like to throw up a frequency analyzer. I have this one from Blue Cats. It's actually free, and I believe they actually updated all their software. So if you wanted to go and get some new stuff from them that's free, I'd say go for it. Put on our good old EQ. I use this one. It's called HEQ. I like it because it comes with a graphic analyzer. So the only reason I do this one first is because this one is more accurate. As you can see, it shows me all of my peaks, whereas this one kind of gives me a little bit of a general idea, as you can see from the peaks. It's up to you either which one you want to do. I just like to look at it before I actually do any processing. So let's begin. Depending on how fast my kick drums are, I go up or down a certain amount. if you're working with really fast kick drums for a majority of the song, like this song is, you're going to want to have your high pass higher up, because then it'll get rid of a lot of the mud in the kick drum and it'll get more punch. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go for around 45, bring that bad boy down, and then I'm going to go ahead and look here and then see where my low end is getting a little crazy and go from there. I'll see you guys back after I finish doing the EQ moves. For EQ moves, I kind of went ahead to the low end. I took out a little bit of 93 just because there's a lot of kick drum in there that I was not enjoying nearly as much. If you go ahead and you listen to... And then over here, over in 140 was a lot of that bass guitar frequency that I was getting a lot of. It's very prominent in 140. I just didn't like. So it's a lot of the same static note, which is something I just wanted to cut out a little bit of. Also over here, a little bit of 2K in the guitar because the higher harmony guitars were cutting through a little bit harsh. Alright, and then I just did a little boost of around 11. I did a boost of about 1 dB at around 11K just because I wanted to give the cymbals a little more prominence. Because next up is the compression phase. Now, what I like to do is get a really good bus compressor. The thing I use is the SSL bus compressor from Waves, which I'm sure you've seen all over the place nowadays. With this guy, I actually have a setting. This is my startup setting, so if you guys want to take a picture or whatever, I find that this setting is a good starting place, and then I can go from here and try to figure out where I want to be. I normally aim for around 4 to 5 on the negative dB compression. So let's go ahead and just take a listen to that real quick. Go. I'm actually going to lower guitars just a little bit now that the compressor's in there so the snare can come through and we should be good. This is where I come through and I look to see if my compression may have added some artifacts that I didn't want, which I was telling you about before for the gating. So if we look here, so this is what I'm talking about. So now that my compressor's in, it's bringing in a little bit of those lower frequencies that I was telling you about that you don't particularly notice it in there. However, sometimes it does come through in a track, especially with mastering when everything gets brought up by the limiter. So what I do is I come over in here, pick up this gate, and so right now you can see where it's coming in. So as you can see over here, you have this working here, bringing it down by -12. So it's not completely turning off the signal. However, it is ducking it to where it's even less noticeable than it was before. And that is definitely going to help us out in the long run, especially if we were to say throw a limiter on here. So let's throw that on real quick just to see what we're working with. So that brings it up to about commercial level, but we are not doing that. We are only working on mixed bus processing today. So next thing I like to do is I actually add this thing. It's called Vitamin. Now what Vitamin does is think of it as a multi-band compressor, but it also kind of gives you control over width. So what I do is I get Vitamin, I leave direct all the way up, and then I leave these all the way down just to get a starting point. And what I like to do is I like to go through each of the bands and figure out what I want to do. Alright, and then the last thing I like to do is come back over to my master fader, put this bad boy at 0, and then go through and lower volume on my plugins, so that way we are hitting around the 0 to +1 is what I do. I also use the VU meter. Basically, it emulates an analog VU meter, one of these right here, except it's the I believe it's modeled after the API's VU meter. As soon as you go above 0 in digital, you start getting what is called digital distortion. That is where you start getting the really bad, when you start sounding like this when you're talking in the microphone. Basically, that's digital distortion. Sorry if that hurt your ears. Now, the thing that's cool about using a VU meter is when you start hitting 0 in the analog realm, there is this thing called analog distortion, which we also know as saturation, and I'm sure you've heard that. There's a lot tossed around everywhere. Saturate this, get some saturation, get some tape emulation on there for nice analog saturation. You know what I'm talking about. So with saturation in the analog world, it's where you're getting the warmth. I'm sure you've heard that term as well from the mix. So what I like to do is I know that once you're hitting above +3 on VU, that's when your digital distortion is kicking in. So I like to sit around 0 to +1 on analog distortion, because most mastering engineers are going to master the output of the song through some sort of analog gear to give it that nice saturation, tape warmth. You understand what I'm talking about. So now that we're at 0, I'm going to just duck the levels down. I'm going to do some final takes, and then we'll listen to the mix with and without the plugins on the mastering chain. Alright, there you go. So that's just a quick look into mix bus processing. I believe is the secret sauce, if you will, to mixing. A lot of people, for some reason, kind of skim over mix bus processing. For a while, when I first started, I actually tried to avoid the mix bus just because you can do a lot to your mix bus that can actually harm it rather than help it. But I feel like the more you experiment with mix bus processing, the more you will actually get familiar with it, and it will actually become your friend. So that is it for this episode. I hope that you did enjoy it. Next week, I do have something really special planned, so stay tuned if you want to see that. Make sure you subscribe, and thank you for stopping by. Be sure to check out my band's album. It's gonna be in the description down below. If you really like metal music, we have an album out and you should check it out. Thank you. Bye. can save it. Hooray! Oh my god. We saved that. Oh my god.